Okay, so we are recording. I'm Jeff Lane. I'm an associate professor at Rutgers in the School of Common Information, and I'm the co-founder and co-chair of DEWG, along with Melissa Aronchik, who's a professor also at Sky. And unfortunately, she's traveling today, so she can't be with us, but she sends her best. Bahar Badi is our graduate administrator. So thank you, Bahar, for helping to promote and put this event together. We have a faculty steering committee composed of Caitlin Petrie, who's our organizer for today's event, Yonaida Rivera, Young Rim Kim. That's our faculty steering group. So we are DEWG, the Rutgers Digital Ethnography Working Group. This is our 5th year in existence, and we are focused on developing the principles, practices, and ethics of digital ethnography to advance a deeper understanding of how people live today through innovative, multimodal methods of doing fieldwork. And to that end, we organize internal supports such as workshops and writing groups. And then we do public-facing things like events like today. We usually do 2 or 3 of these a semester, and we do conference sessions to help build fellowship around digital ethnography, to share best practices, to network with digital ethnographers in different career points and at different institutions, et cetera, and across disciplines. So I'll just share in our chat here where you can sign up for our mailing list, which is on our website. So I'll share that. And also we have a YouTube channel where we share past events like demystifying the dissertation to book process and ethnographies of the datafied state. And just to make one more note before we get into the meat and potatoes for today, our next public event will be November 8th on the topic of finding research funds and monies for ethnographic projects. So come see us again November 8th. All right, let me pop in the chat that information that I said. Okay, so today's event, DEWG Election Edition, is obviously very timely as we're all sweating out Election Day. I'm going to turn it over now to our event organizer, Caitlin Petrie, to go over the plan for the session and to introduce our awesome panelists.
Thanks, Jeff. And hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. And we're thrilled. I'm thrilled to be able to bring together this group of scholars to talk about online culture and the 2024 election. I think it's probably something a lot of us are thinking about, but to kind of have a space to, as Jeff said, sweat it out together, I think is going to be really good and generative. And I'm really, really excited to hear from our panelists. So, I'll start by saying like a little bit about sort of why we decided to do this event at this moment. And then I'll introduce our 3 wonderful panelists. And then I'm going to ask them each to speak about their research program for, very briefly, informally. And then I'll ask some questions as the moderator. And then in the last half hour or so, we'll open it up to Q&A from you all. So feel free to, when we get to the Q&A session, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom and then unmute when it's your turn. I'll call on you, or you can always feel free to just put your question in the chat, and Bahar and I will also be monitoring the chat for folks' questions in there. So I think that the idea for this event came about, I think Jeff and I were talking about, what we wanted to do for our fall programming, and the election, I think, is something that is sort of hanging over a lot of our heads right now. And I think we're always thinking in DEWG about, first of all, what is the nature of this tool of digital ethnography, right? Like, what are its qualities? What can it give us? What can it illuminate or shed light on about networked social life that might be challenging to get at with other methods, or that digital ethnography is sort of particularly well suited for? And then I think we try to organize events that really tap into or allow us to invite scholars who use these digital ethnographic methods in ways that really highlight their strengths to get at these substantive research questions that we have. And so in thinking about the election coming up in just a few weeks, but also just kind of, I think, online communication and visual culture around elections more generally. This one's obviously kind of pegged to the US presidential election in 2024, but I think we were also interested in just thinking about the way in which elections right now feel, as the kids would say, like very online, and ways in which maybe in past presidential elections, I'm speaking here about the US context, there tended to be like a lot of online discourse, and then the campaigns also were sort of putting out their official statements, but not necessarily like sinking their teeth into or fully participating in memes and things like that. And there was something about the kind of online conversation, the fact that we saw, the VP candidate Tim Walz mention the rumor that originally circulated on X about JD Vance having a relationship with a couch, right? And that came up in a speech by the vice president. I think that was something that kind of caught our attention, and we thought, maybe there's a way to kind of leverage what we do in DEWG, and bring together scholars who are engaged in this kind of work to understand like what's going on with this very online election. So that's a little bit about what sort of motivated us to do this event now. And I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists now, and then after that, I'll give them each a chance to also like introduce themselves and their research program in their own words as well. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brooklyn Gibson. Hi, Brooklyn. So Brooklyn is an Internet Studies scholar and an assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University in the School of Communication and Information. So she's one of our new colleagues here, and we're absolutely thrilled to welcome her to Sky. She is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research areas include digital and social media environments, Black feminist digital and technology studies, and the intersection of race, gender, social media, and power. So as we can see, lots of things that are coming up a lot in this election, as well as many other spaces. Her current research takes an intersectional approach to analyzing how anti-Black discourses manifest themselves in everyday discursive exchanges within Black social media spaces. Dr. Gibson received her PhD in communication from the University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. In 2021, she was awarded a fellowship from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy. And that was to support her research for her forthcoming first book, Network Misogynoir, which will explore the iterative relationship between contempt for Black women, disinformation, cognitive bias, and algorithmic recommendation systems. Dr. Gibson is an editor of the forthcoming edited volume, Intersectional Internet 2, Power, Politics, and Labor. And she's also part of the NYU Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. She's an affiliate there. So welcome, Brooklyn. And now I'll introduce Dr. Fenwick McKelvey. Dr. McKelvey is an assistant professor in information and communication technology policy in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University. He is the author of Internet Daemons, Digital Communications Possessed, and which was the winner of the 2019 Gertrude J. Robinson Book Award. He's also the co-author of a book called The Permanent Campaign, New Media, New Politics, and has co-edited special issues on the alt-rights in Canada. And he holds a PhD in the joint program of communication and culture between York University and Ryerson University. And last but absolutely not least, we have Dr. Francesca Tripodi. Dr. Tripodi is an associate professor at the School of Information and Library Science and a principal investigator at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC Chapel Hill, CTAP for short. They also have amazing events, and you should all get on their mailing list as well. She has twice testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, explaining to senators how relevance is gained to drive ideologically based queries and spread conspiratorial logic. In addition to her research on search engines, Dr. Tripodi's work has documented how cisgender women who meet the threshold for inclusion on Wikipedia are nearly twice as likely to be considered non-notable subjects as their cis male peers. Dr. Tripodi in 2023 received the Award for Impact and Excellence from the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington. Her research has been covered in the United States by news outlets like NPR, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The New Yorker, Wired, as well as prestigious international publications. So What an incredible group of scholars to welcome here. I'm thrilled to have you all. I'm going to now give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your research program, and if you want to sort of say how it relates to or how it's shaping how you're sort of following along this election, whether or not you're doing formal research about the election, please do feel free. I'll start with, I'll go in the order that I started with the bios. So Brooklyn, take it away.
It's like no matter how often I do Zoom, I still am like, where's the button? Am I muted? Am I good? Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I I am really excited to be here. One little minor caveat, I always tell people that even though so much of my research centers on politics, it's not always electoral politics. I realize that a lot of times, because the work that I do looks at Black communities, we think about Black communities in terms of like how they participate in electoral politics, but I'm more concerned about how political conversations that may be related to electoral politics impact and shape the real lived experiences of Black folks. So I'm in this space, but I'm also like kind of right next to it. When I wrote my dissertation at USC Annenberg, it focused on kind of like anti-Black woman tropes in meme aggregator pages, and thinking about like the effective quality of like what these memes were doing, how people were forming community around them, and like what was the point and the purpose, right? Because like so much of internet culture, we think things are just for the laughs, and I was not laughing and I didn't think it was funny. And I also felt like there was something more on the back end happening with the people that were participating in these online communities. And so that spawned like kind of a whole research trajectory and kind of trying to figure out how and why Black people would be participating in parroting what I consider to be like white supremacist discourses. I know today we're going to be talking a lot about digital ethnography, and that the reason why I love ethnography so much is because it helps me answer those big questions of why I know a thing is happening, but why is it happening, and trying to like make sense of it in the like socio-political, historical context of it all. And I think like the paradox of Black people who will tell you, I love Black people, spreading hatred and parroting white supremacist talking points really interests me. And so currently, as was mentioned before, I'm working on a book manuscript, and the name keeps on changing. But right now I'm settled on the Black Mirror worlds, like racialized disinformation and alternative like networks. And I talk about the concept of networked misogynoir in there, which is inspired by that earlier dissertation research, in thinking about like how people are forming communities around their shared disdain and hatred for Black women, but also trying to put this into context that doesn't necessarily point fingers, right? Because then it becomes like a us-them conversation. And I kind of if I were to do that research, I would be perpetuating what I'm seeing in that space. What I'm finding is that communities that are disenfranchised from information and understanding of how things work in society usually result into conspiracism, anti-reactionary feminism. And I'm really starting to, or not starting to, but I'm really focused on presenting a project that has a holistic picture that's just not like, men against women within this space. I really want to tease out the nuances of thinking about how Black men and also Black women who participate in these harmful discourses are victims in themselves of kind of like being disenfranchised. And we can talk about that more, especially in the part about pulling out the nuance, because my worst nightmare is that I write something and then people are like, yes, here's the problem with Black people, when it's really like, no, these are the problem with the white supremacist discourses. And when we don't have the tools to readily identify what's happening, we can like subconsciously regurgitate these things. We can also do things that are against solidarity, against community, without even really knowing it, right? And so how can we provide the tools for people to talk through politics without like resorting to reductive narratives? Yeah, so that's my little 2 minutes. I'm real short.
Wonderful. Perfect. Thank you so much, Brooklyn. Fenwick, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to thank everybody for the invitation to be on such like an amazing panel. I'm very excited as much to get to talk, but also get to learn about all the work being discussed. And I'm very excited about Brooklyn's comments too about the latter point, particularly about disenfranchisement, access, and thinking about solidarity, because I think those are all like really critical questions. For the field. And so I just want to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming from unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganaele Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters in which I gather today. DEWG, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is a home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, and we respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future, and ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And I think territorial acknowledgements become really important in Canada, and talking through I think some of our own histories and consequences of trying to kind of decenter communication studies, and I think or decenter whiteness in communication studies, and I think trying in some ways that connects to an overarching frame for me about some of the motivations behind the meme research that I'm talking about today is that often in thinking about the field of political communication, where I've really have seen myself, it's been trying to find my own voice in that community. And I feel very much among peers and kind of allies here, but often political communication is coming from a very political science, information flow, very much focused on kind of content analysis and message delivery. And what I've found is that there's a need to integrate cultural studies and protect perspectives from cultural studies, particularly the British cultural studies that's really popular in Canada, with these discussions of political communication. I think if there's one way of thinking about what I hope my work contributes to this panel is that there's a real opportunity in thinking about that link and not thinking about that silence between the two as a problem. It's more of an opportunity. And I think that particularly as we move towards the spaces and sites that we want to study on this panel, it's really important that that's where the cultural studies tradition, as we talk about political fandom or political culture, becomes so important and really rich. And I think that to me is part of the really exciting motivation. And one thing that I hope I can mention to invite people in the room, because it took me a long time to really realize that some of what I'm doing in political communication is trying to acknowledge that I'm coming from it from a different point of view, and that part of the intervention is trying to think about how cultural studies has a real impact and significance to political communication. And I think this is someone, I think Francesca can speak to this too, of living through the disinformation studies moment, how much there's an attempt to replicate a very instrumental view as disinformation, I think to Brooklyn's point, to really acknowledge what are the communities that desire, that enjoy, that participate, and just looking maybe at the content of the messages, which is what turned me to digital ethnography. So right now I'm finishing up a book project that also changes, but the title right now is called Sim Politics, which is the history of computers in American elections. So really trying to think about this kind of intersection of how political campaigns have come to be imagined through computer systems, and this breakdown of political systems and computer systems. So it's a little off from the meme work, but I think there continues to be this sense of really trying to make attending to the ideas and kind of imaginaries that go into the production of political communication. As a last point, I'll say that, thankfully, I don't have an election right now, and so my regards to all of you living through it. Don't worry, there's probably one coming in Canada at any moment. But I will just give a shout out. One of the ways that I want to just pass the spotlight off to me a little bit to think that one of the things I'm really excited about is supporting one of my fantastic PhD candidates, Colleen McCool, who's doing work in the communication studies program here at Concordia, looking at the professionalization of meme and meme politics within political campaigns. And I think that really that's exciting for me and a continuation of this work, because I think, Caitlin, as you said at the start, we're in this very interesting moment where campaigns all of a sudden have become very online, and these attending to memes, which 3 or 4 years ago you're trying to defend as not some sort of weirdo theory of politics, is really just integral all of a sudden. And all I say is that to me, there's this very interesting shift in how we think about the professionalism of political campaigns. shifting. And I would just want to credit that. That's one of the things I'm looking forward to is Colleen's work, which is really looking at how staffers are coming to think about and work mimetically in their campaigns and the consequences of that. So, so it's not me, but I'm just giving a plug to what I think is some fantastic research to come. And with that, I'll pass it on.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Fenwick. And hi, Colleen. I think I saw your name in the attendees, and I hope we hear from you in the Q&A because your work sounds really fascinating and obviously extremely germane to what we're talking about and kind of trying to make sense of this contemporary moment. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Francesca.
Hi, everyone. I'm Francesca Tripodi, and I am a sociologist that's been doing digital ethnography for a while. So my first digital ethnography was of Yik Yak, the now defunct app back in the day. And that was part of my dissertation work, looking at how a platform designed for participation ended up marginalizing and disenfranchising already isolated populations within the community, and thinking about how society and technology interact. And that's basically what I've been doing ever since. And then also I've done a lot of work on Wikipedia, which was a mixed methods project involving in-person ethnography on like the back end of Wikipedia, as well as scraping metadata and looking at articles for deletion and doing some very just like basic statistics on that. And then my project that was my book, that was when I was a postdoc at Data and Society, was doing an in-depth ethnographic study of two Republican groups, a women's group and a college group, and thinking about where they found news and information that they could trust. And a huge part of that project is I kind of invented this new methodology that I call media immersion. So I was thinking about how ethnography is often distinct, right? You have like the digital and then you have the in-person, but actually they're very much enmeshed. And so in addition to my in-person ethnographic observations, I created a Facebook account exclusively for the project. And part of the informed consent process of people I interviewed was asking them if I could follow them on Facebook. I don't have a personal Facebook, which made this easier. And then I studied the news and information they liked and shared and commented on, and also studied the ads that Facebook gave to me as a person that consumed this type of news. And then I completely replaced my news and information diet for 4 months. So I only did news and information that my respondents had described as newsworthy, and I refrained from my typical news diet. And as a result, I think it was just a really enabled a level of observation that I would have otherwise not had. So kind of thinking, I'd love to talk to any of y'all about kind of the where does one start, where does one stop kind of conversation, especially as we can continue to be in this environment that we're at. Right now I'm working on a book that is, gee, thank you. I need to write just a separate methods paper on it because it's in my book, but I need to write a separate methods paper on media immersion. And then, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought. I'm writing a book right now on parental rights politics. So how do communities that organize around parental rights actually destroy the rights of people and adults, and why is this different than child safety? And then I have a new lab called the Spill Lab, which is looking at search prompt integrity and learning lab. And we are working at the connection between deep stories, which is a sociological idea of thinking about the worldviews or the narratives that shape the way we see the world. That's like the easiest way to think about it. And how do those collide with data voids? So data voids are absences of information online. And so I'm studying like, how do people fill those voids with these narratives that have been told and retold for so often that you don't have to know the whole story to think it's true. So narratives that feel true, even if they're not. And so we're looking at Wikipedia and thinking about like what we refer to as refractive monitoring when it comes to understanding the interconnectedness of information systems. So that is where I'm working now, and I'm excited to talk to you all about what your projects are and how we can help you.
Thank you so much. My brain is going with a million connections that I'm seeing between all three of you. I think, and so I want to just reiterate, like, I hope this can be a sort of informal conversation. And if you want to pose a question to one of the other panelists, like, please do so. I guess like the first question that I want to open up with, because we are the Digital Ethnography Working Group, is, and Francesca, your comments about the methods that you employed, in your book really like dovetail with this, but I'm interested in hearing each of you speak explicitly about how you conceptualize and do digital ethnography in your own scholarship, and how, in your view and in your practice, it might be distinct, if overlapping with other types of methods that you might use. So, because this is, I think, a conversation that we have a lot in DEWG, is like, what exactly is this thing that we're doing, and how do we define it, and do we need to define it, and like, how do we sort of allow that definition to adapt and change as technology changes and as our fields change as well. So I'm interested in hearing each of you speak about that, and how it's played out in your work or is playing out in your thinking right now. Should I call on one of you? Francesca, you're like pinned for me right now.
I'll start it. That's fine. Well, I'm going to start actually by quoting Fenwick, because what I think he really described, and Brooklyn also talks about this as well, is what I think connects a lot of our work is we don't think about politics as voting. We're thinking about politics as power. And a lot of times I think the questions that people who aren't familiar with ethnography ask is like, how is this not content analysis? How is digital ethnography not content analysis, right? And I would say the difference is that aspect of like immersion and cultural understanding. So you're not just, I mean, obviously, I do content analysis on some of the things that are shared in the communities that I'm studying online. That's part, content analysis is part of any good ethnographic project. But I think what is unique about digital ethnography is that you're becoming embedded in a space. So part of I have a study on like the reopen groups during COVID. And I was inside of 3 different public Facebook groups, studying what is the stuff that they're looking at? How are they engaging with content moderation? And I could have very easily done just a content analysis of the news that they shared, but I don't think that gets at like the community or the power aspect or the historical analysis or any of the rich work about why those things matter to that community. And so I think that's the aspect of digital ethnography, is really understanding that you're studying community formation and like the power dynamics within that community, as well as the kind of information that they're sharing.
That's so helpful. And it makes me, oh yeah, Fenwick, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I wanted to just pick up on Francesca's point also to kind of say that some of the motivations that at least I think led to maybe a bit more of a resurgence or more discussion of digital ethnography need to be kind of situated in somewhat historically. And I think that's an important part for folks on this, especially if you're having to defend yourself about why you're using ethnography versus another method, because a lot of what the work that happened here really in part comes from a pushback against Twitter research or like now X research, because I always joke that if Twitter hadn't been invented, social scientists would have to invent it because it was so perfect, like 150 word snap bites that were so perfectly designed for content analysis that were easy to access. And so much of the field was really focused on Twitter analysis for a long time. And I think partially the promise of big data Twitter analysis, which was like this very, very broad vantage point. And I really take to heart a lot of the criticisms, I think probably best put in Data Feminism about the consequences of this kind of big, God's eye view from nowhere about how we're going to access digital research. And I think part of what digital ethnography is trying to do is think about kind of situated vantage points and the ways that we're really foregrounding the partial accounts that we're able to offer of social media, in contrast to what became this huge moment around the promise of big data in politics, which is really, I think, hit a kind of a mega point in the Facebook studies, where it's only a few researchers that really have access to a lot of this data. And I mean, that's not a criticism, but I think it does, like criticism of those researchers, but it does think about how there is a politics in choosing this method and a way of trying to think about how research can be done otherwise, given the fact that the kind of big vantage point that was promised so much around digital election research really has led to a lot of problems, and we can discuss that a bit further. But I think that to me is really why these politics and the politics of this research methodology matter and have to be kind of understood. In contrast, I think Francesca or Brooklyn can speak about that, maybe their own journey, but that was always really kind of tangible to me, is that looking at memes really was something that didn't fit into easy content analysis, and that was the fun of it, was that it wasn't something you're going to be able to do a content analysis of, and that was really intentional, at least, to just point out the kind of flaws of the kind of a more big data approach. Which I think is helpful to remind folks about some of these terms and just why this work matters so much in contrast to a lot of what's being promised around big data elections research.
Yeah, and I think like I came into doing like digital ethnography research just because I was hitting a wall with the limitations of what I could do with like content analysis and discursive analysis. Because in my graduate training, I was taught that like, your methods are dictated by the types of questions that you're asking, right? So when I was asking a research question like about what was being said about Black women in these particular spaces, it was really easy to answer that with content analysis or discursive analysis. Here's what's being said, here's how often it comes up, here's the frequency, like very quantitative things. But to do that like interpretive work to say, well, why, felt like I needed a further investigation, because I could just look at it and say why, but I just saw a lot of scholars doing that and misinterpreting the conversations that were happening, especially in like Black subcultural spaces that are so layered and nuanced. And so it became, I saw like, I don't know, this is just my little like grad school frustration and maybe research, frustration with research in general. It's just like, people feeling like they could always look into a community and interpret it with just their own knowledge. I believe as scholars, we're reading, we're critical, we're on the ball. There's so much that we can bring to the conversation, but we also, especially with exploring communities, have to bring those communities into that conversation as well, because there's so many blind spots that we have. A lot of folks will say, oh, well, you're studying, Black communities and you must know everything. No, because everything that happens in the Black cultural space is incredibly nuanced by region, by class. There's so much that I need, kind of like that immersive experience to really tease out the broader context. And just as a specific example, I always get so triggered when people are talking about like Black conspiracism in this way that's like very like looking down the nose and they just don't know and we just need more media literacy. And it's like, no, there's a history of Black people being disenfranchised from information, and there's a reason why these stories get created. And that history of conspiracism is really important when you think about modern day conspiracism that circulates today, because it's how people tell stories and rationalize things in the absence of information. So we can even look at quote unquote wrong information, bad information, and it can still tell us something about the contemporary like anxieties and fears and concerns that people within this community are having. And those can also be bridges to bring people into like larger, more nuanced understandings of what's happening politically, if we at first like just respect that the way that they're communicating is very different than what we're used to in an academic space or in a particular class space. And this comes up for me all the time with the class thing, I think, because I like, what do we say? Like I grew up like working class to poor, and then it's like you go through life, things, circumstances change. Like a lot of the people I'm around more so often are now middle class. And I see the big difference in how we communicate amongst just those class groups, right? And so a lot of the work that I do is trying to uplift the voices of the disenfranchised because they don't have the same languages, but I can't do that just solely from myself or my perspective. I'm doing the digital ethnography work to bring in those voices, to bring in the nuances of what's happening in those spaces. So yeah, those are just my thoughts. Like I just was running up against a wall of like, here's what's happening, but I cannot be the sole voice in saying why it's happening. Because this is not oftentimes, my community, a lot of the times the communities that I'm looking at, the way that they process information and politics is just completely different from me. But I don't see it as necessarily bad. I see it just as a different way of talking around the same topics. And so how can we bridge these conversations? That was like my primary motivation for kind of engaging in digital ethnography and this type of work.
Yeah, I love that because I think that it really resonates with, I think, a lot of the experience that maybe we had in graduate school, or that maybe some of the graduate students here today like are encountering, which is that you kind of sometimes come to a method because you just can't not come to it. Like it's just you didn't necessarily set out with it, but then you, as you put it, like hit a wall and you realize that you need, kind of what Fenwick said, but what you were also talking about, Brooklyn, which is this kind of these situated vantage points, like, and to sort of access those in online spaces. I also think, and I want to give you all an opportunity to react to each other too, but I think, Fenwick, what you were saying about the discourse around big data and how that, like in some ways, the sort of rise of digital ethnography might be in some sense a sort of response to the discourse around big data, the kind of promises, some of them turning out to be empty around what big data could give, but also the kind of epistemological assumptions that were the foundation of the big data moment, right? One of which was, so all three of you have sort of brought up this notion of the importance of process, right? So which is hard to get at through content analysis, right? Like easier to get at if you do this kind of embedding that you're all talking about. And I was very struck by you bringing up big data discourse, Fenwick, because I think there was really many years where there was a sort of shared idea, definitely in big tech spaces, but also in some scholarly spaces, which was like, if you have enough data, you actually don't need to worry about mechanisms. You don't need to worry about process. Like if you know that, something, there's a pattern in a data set where something is correlated with something else, you can actually start to like make decisions or have findings based on just that without looking under the hood. So I just think that that's so striking as you're all sort of laying out this beautiful warrant for doing digital ethnography to sort of understand the way political discourses are contextual and they're embedded and they're situated, but also that there's like a process that produces the meme that then becomes part of the content analysis, and that can get lost. So I want to kind of tie that together. If any of you want to jump in, feel free. Yeah, Fenwick, go ahead.
You just reminded me, like, one of the things that I'm really, thankful and very stoked to be part of is work around indigenous perspectives on artificial intelligence, or what's called abundant intelligences here. But it's kind of built a bit on Brooklyn's point, where, one thing that at least is more and more in my mind is, what are the consequences of thinking about knowledge as just something that's on demand or on tap that we have access to? And a lot of what I learned through indigenous collaborators is that forms of knowledge are not just something that are a resource to be tapped. And that's not to say that I've answered that, or that's something that kind of I think through now in my research, but really it's like, what are the obligations or the ways that telling the stories of these communities is something that is a relationship, and there's certain protocols about ensuring that knowledge is connected and tapped. And that partially is what an ethics proposal is about, but goes beyond that too. And that all to say is that it's not necessarily something we answered, but something that I think I hold as a challenge, and what is the next step, or how do we think about digital communication after something like big data, where this idea of having big data as a standing reserve or a big resource is something that we've come to call into question. And what are those next steps? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a one size fit all, or what types of communities it's the same protocols, but that's something at least to be mindful about the design and discussions of the research projects.
I think it's also interesting when thinking about big data is how messy it is. So I've had the opportunity to draw from very large data sets. And it was interesting. Well, first of all, the Wikipedia data that I used in my in a couple of my papers now existed, but until I did ethnography, I didn't know the question to ask it. So like, I'm not a data scientist. I partner with data scientists. And he was like, we went through multiple iterations and meetings to understand, like, what does he need to write? Like, what data set do we need to pull from the vast data that is Wikipedia? And that would not have been available to me without my ethnographic observations. And then interpreting that data is also very messy. You know, it comes out as this like just massive Excel file, you know, and then you have to, you still have to do a lot of like work and understanding it. And I think really good data science has to have ethnography. And this also worked with, in my book, I drew from massive data sets from YouTube, and we wouldn't know, like, what questions does a data scientist ask, if not social science ones? And so I think that there has to be a bridge between what we're doing as ethnographers and the capabilities that data scientists have. And also, it's always good to have a really good data science friend or colleague. If it's not going to be you, I highly recommend.
Francesca, can I just follow up on what you said about the Wikipedia research? Like, I'm curious if you could say kind of, or give an example of something that you looked for in this data set that you knew, because like, what did you see ethnographically that then pushed you to like explore the data set?
Yeah, sure. So I'll, if anyone's interested in the paper, I'll put it in here too. It's open access. So I did an ethnographic observation of editathons, and hold on, sometimes the DOI goes through UNC if I'm on campus, but I think that if that doesn't work for y'all, just let me know. So I did ethnographic observations of editathons, which are small meetups of editors of Wikipedia who want to try to close the gender gap, which means create biographies about notable women that don't yet exist. And while I was at these events, women that were being added were being nominated for deletion during the event. And then I was interviewing these editors, and they're like, oh yeah, that happens all the time. We have to flag these articles and make sure that they stay on. And I was like, is this also happening for men? And they're like, I don't know, we're not adding men, we're adding women because these are editathons. So I took all this rich, beautiful ethnographic data and I submitted it to like 4 journals, and it got called like anecdotal. And it was, you know, the typical stuff we face as ethnographers. And one reviewer said, maybe these women just aren't notable, you know. Then I like wanted to throw my computer through a window. But instead, I partnered with a data scientist at UVA. So I got a scholarship through the Scholars Lab at UVA to help my dissertation work. And this came out of my dissertation work. And while I was at editathons, I was like, well, there's this space called Articles for Deletion. And Articles for Deletion is like a separate database of all articles being considered for deletion on Wikipedia. So first of all, I didn't know that deletion happened, right? That's something I learned in ethnography. Second of all, I didn't realize there was all these like contentious debates happening in this like separate space that wasn't Wikipedia, but had everything to do with what is on Wikipedia. And then third, I started learning the language of Wikipedians. So like keep, delete, merge, how do I interpret this data if I'm not myself, someone who edits, because I didn't want to be editing. I didn't want to do participant observation. I wanted to do ethnography. So, so that's how it came about. And then because of that, because of articles for deletion, he was able to write the script that pulled all the articles specifically that were tagged for biographies. And then with a different data scientist, we used Wikidata to match based on pronoun use in the pages. So she, her, or he, him. And then we had a separate set. There's just a very low number of trans biographies, which is actually a whole separate paper that could be written for anybody interested. Yeah, and then that's how, and then because I was able to analyze like 15 months worth of data, but it still was like very hard to get that paper published. That paper took me like 5 years to publish.
Wow. Okay. Graduate student.
So happy when I came out.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I got to be on NPR and I was like, yeah.
The longer it takes, the happier you are in it.
Yes, but I think that's the hard part about ethnography. It takes a very long time. And sometimes like the work that you do doesn't get recognized as like method, and it's frustrating. At least I'm sure all of us have faced this, but maybe not. Maybe you all are luckier than I.
It's just sailing through. No problem. No
Sailing
edit,
through
no,
life. Just
no revising, resubmit. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I wanna pivot now to the 2024 election because, you know, that's why we're here, but I'm so interested in hearing about how you all approach your work. I want to start with a question that is just like in your sort of either with your researcher hat on or just like as an observer of what is happening with this election, maybe being on social media, following the news about it. We've seen, I think, a lot of like sort of I've seen people on social media talk about this as like the vibes election, or this is like a very online election. And I think we've definitely encountered like this cross-pollination between the campaigns, both of them, Trump's campaign and Harris's campaign, and kind of meme culture, but also hashtags and emoji and things like that. And I'm curious, like, from each of your vantage, is there a particular either meme or piece of disinformation or AI generated image or some piece of something, some like media artifact related to this election that seems particularly like analytically rich to you, where you're sort of wanting to, whether or not you're actually doing ethnographic research, you could see it being something where you're like content analysis, for example, would not really get me to a full understanding of like what is happening with, you know, the childless cat ladies or the couch thing or whatever. I'm just, yeah. So is there something that has sort of struck you as digital ethnographers in observing the discourse around this election and the online culture around it as being like ripe for an ethnographic excavation?
This is not something that I'm working on, but it's something, well, with this election, I cannot get over the 180 that I've witnessed with like the reception of Kamala Harris in like Black digital spaces. When she announced that she was running for president in the last election, what was that, in January 2019, whenever she did that announcement in Oakland, there was like an immediate, like what felt to me like, what is it, astroturfing campaign that hit her. And she went from nobody knows who she is to like the next morning, it was all of these conversations about her as top cop and all these disinformation things that hit her about how she put more Black men in jail. It's just things that I knew were half true, untrue, right? And it completely tanked her campaign in a way that was really interesting. And I watched her kind of just be really dismissive of this. Like she called it bots. And it's like, yes, it is bots, but bots seed a narrative. And now this narrative is taking on its own life, right? And I know that there's a lot of reasons that we could critique Kamala for the roles that she's taken in some of her political stances, but so much of what hit her was like misogynoir, right? So now in this contemporary election, I've just watched a lot of sentiments change. And that is just interesting to me. It's very rich, but also within that, I am seeing these subcultural discourses that I think are very deep Black cultural cuts that are not in the mainstream. I think when we think about the vibes elections, we're thinking about Kamala's brat, we're thinking about coconuts. This is like the mainstream stuff. But Black folks are talking about an AKA being in the White House, a woman who is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and what that means. And there's a lot of misogynoir mixed in that. If nobody has the context for Alpha Kappa Alpha, I feel like people just say, oh, it's a Black sorority. But the women of Alpha Kappa Alpha, which, full disclosure, I am one, are stereotyped with this false history of this was the organization that only let in light-skinned Black women, which is not true. A lot of Black social orgs only let in Black people, light-skinned Black people. This is across groups, all types of groups, not just sororities and fraternities, but it has never been a part of the membership standards. But there's all of these jokes about what it means to have her in the White House and how the AKAs are going to be insufferable and like what that means. And I just don't see anyone talking about that. And so that's like really rich for me. And those are the type of like deep Black cultural like cuts that I'm the most interested in, because that does play into attitudes toward Kamala. We're hearing, I think she had the release of the, what is it, the project or the plan for the Black men that was released like in the last few days, I think maybe yesterday, but that was very needed and necessary, on her part, because there is all this insider cultural stuff that's going back and forth about her being above the community because of these different like credentials and things that she has. So that's something that's really interesting to me, and I don't hear anybody talking about, and I don't know that I'm necessarily going to take that up.
You write that paper, you have to write it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a like something that I'm working on where I'm talking about the disinformation that hit Kamala. It's a paper that I could not get published anywhere because everybody was like, what are you talking about? And it was hard to have this like nuanced conversation about her stance within Black space, because the way she's understood in the mainstream America is also very, very different. And so it was just a hard paper, but I want to revisit it now that there's been this 180 flip, and then talk about the nuances of that. But again, speaking to the limitations of the type of work that we do, it's like if you can't tie it back to mainstream understandings, it's kind of harder. But I think that the non-mainstream understandings is much more interesting. Like if we really want to understand, how Black folks are understanding Kamala, it's not enough to just say, oh, it's birtherism. That drove me crazy. I was like, this is actually not birtherism. This is classic, classism, colorism. And there's a deeper conversation we could be having about that on top of the legitimate critiques of her as a candidate, right? But it's hard to do that when we always have to like, situate our work in mainstream discourses. So, I mean, I'm going to give it a shot, but we'll see.
Really hope you do. I would love to. Do either of the other of you want to weigh in on?
I'll just say that, I mean, I'm not studying this election per se. I'm looking at groups that are definitely activated in this election. But one thing that was recently at a CTAP event that we had, and it was my colleague Meredith Clark was saying, and who else was it? Shannon McGregor, my colleague Shannon McGregor and Meredith Clark were talking about the cat memes that were circulating and the role of AI in these memes. So it was interesting because there was a lot of hand wringing around AI and how it's going to play out this election. And we saw a little bit, I mean, obviously the false Swift announcement but the biggest use of AI so far that I've seen has been these like ridiculous cat memes furthering the racialized disinformation that was circulated during the only presidential debate. And what I thought was really what I loved about what Dr. Clark said, and my own work thinks about this as well, is like the historical role that played, and that like she was talking about how, in the 90s, there were memes that that dog was being eaten in Chinese restaurants, right? So there is a deep story behind this meme, and that the reason it was so widespread or like spread so quickly is that it's not because of the epistemological, it was because of the ontological. And so how do we understand that deep-rooted otherism that was like embedded in this meme? And so yeah, I just shout out to Meredith and Shannon and their work.
Can I just tack on that real quick?
Yes, please.
Just really quickly, and I'm going to share a link to this book. It's called I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Rumor in African American Culture. And they talk about all of these tropes in conspiracy memes. And they talk about the tropes of what the other people eat. And they talk about how, like, across racial groups, each group will have the same rumor about the other group. And this goes back way further than the 90s. It goes all the way back to like the first encounters when Black folks were being kidnapped from Africa, and they didn't know why they were being kidnapped. And so there was a rumor going around that the people with the ghost face, the white face, were eating people. And so then this same rumor continues through like colonial histories, and it doesn't come from Black folks. It comes from like this intercultural exchange of not understanding the other. And so there'll be these conversations about, you know, Black people putting bones through their nose or eating things in the woods. And there's like this historical like thing that has gone on forever. So the trope is like, they follow the trope like not only through the 90s, but back to the 50s, the 30s, and all these different communities. So it definitely does hit some like strong emotional records. And they call it a Eva Topsy myth, meaning that like Black groups and white groups have the same myth going in the opposite direction. So if there exists a myth about like Haitian folks, for example, there might be the opposite going through, but it's just really interesting to think about. Sorry. I love this book, and Patricia Turner is incredible in thinking about like Black conspiracism.
Yeah.
I just wanted to,
No, go ahead.
I wanted to to clean up a couple points that I was like super excited about in terms of comments. But I think another key piece for me would be Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner's work, which I think really was also helpful for me in connecting and talking about these deep stories and linking up some of the satanic panics in the 90s, which were also prevalent in Canada. So it's like interesting to think about these as global movements and how that informs what's going on. And I think that type of work, and I have I heard it through the grapevine, I think is a good example of just how much some of the folklore or history or cultural studies is important for saying that some of these tropes continue. In fact, that's partially also what making sense of the success of coded white nationalist rhetoric is doing, is it's playing on these older stories and just, differently packaging, which is important. The three, I wanted to say just three brief points. One, I think to Brooklyn's comments about just I do not know, and I love learning about Black sorority culture. But I mean, I just want to say that like one thing that's super interesting is how we might also be witnessing a shift where I've heard it, Crystal Abbott and others are talking about like more fractal publics, or where's the idea of a mass public isn't more called into question. I think that's a very existential question for the field, because it's not like a mass audience, but how are campaigns capable of maintaining multiple identities and speaking in a literacy across different groups, which I think is worth unpacking more, and how that ability of maybe it's code switching or different ways of speaking across cultures is a shift in what is a mass movement rather than something being massively popular. And that's something that certainly was never, and that goes back to Stuart Hall's work, that's never been something contested, but I think it's something to be more mindful about, is what we count of and think of as the popular, so to speak. The other 2 points I just wanted to say is that, some of the shift towards more, Caitlin, you put in your questions as like a vibes election. I always see myself as someone who's very indebted to another CTAP scholar like Daniel Crease and talking about technologically intensive campaigning. And that's always been a really informing part of my work. And I actually feel like if this is a vibes election, it becomes interesting because you might see a shift. And I'm always inspired another scholar like Paul Edwards' Closed World book, which is a really history of Cold War politics, ends with this idea of a green world, or what's outside of. And I feel like it's interesting where this election might be a shift where what we think about as digital communication is less about management, organization, or the technology, the parts we've traditionally emphasized in technology intensive campaigning towards this kind of idea of vibes and network sociology, which I think would have some major impacts. And I think if we do see the vibe changing and continuing, then that's something that's going to have real ramifications for the field as we go forward. The last thing to say super quickly, and like I said, I'm not following the election, but I do a lot of work on AI. That's really a defining thing for me. And one of the ones for me is just looking at regrettably Elon Musk's use of AI to create Kamala Harris in the communist costume. And I think it's just like, to me, everyone's like freaking out about generative AI as though we didn't have something like that. Is like and I actually think that meme and meta culture is a way for us to really anticipate how artificial intelligence is going to be used, because people are going to use it to make memes, to make jokes, and to do this kind of half serious, half not. I think, to Brooklyn's comments about, the kind of wink humor that it's like, oh, I know it's generative AI. I'm going to share it anyways. I'm not claiming it's real, which really points to what the uptake is going to be. No one's claiming it's actual real. It just allows for, I think, arguably, in like Trump's sense, fantastical theories and fantasy to be expressed in a different way, in a more visual regime. Which really, I think, speaks to what some of this ethnographic does in terms of us making sense of what are trends in political communication elections.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on a point here, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A for the rest of the session. But I think that something that that I've been thinking about, hearing you all speak and knowing your work, is the way that digital ethnographic approaches can particularly enrich the sort of what has been kind of the mainstream disinformation conversation, right? And each of you have sort of spoken about that. I think there was an article in NPR that really struck me, and I pulled a quote from it where there was an AI generated image of a little girl in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, and she was in a rowboat and crying, and she was holding a puppy, and it was very almost cartoonish. I mean, it didn't look real, but it was shared widely and was also shared by Utah Senator Mike Lee. And then when it came out that this was AI generated, he took it down. But then there was another Republican National Committee member from Georgia, and she didn't take it down. And she wrote on X, I don't know where this photo came from, and honestly, it doesn't matter. It's emblematic of the trauma and pain people are living through, right? And so, that I think is really, really an important thing for like the disinformation scholarship conversation to take on board, right? And it connects to what Brooklyn was saying, like this notion that that like media literacy is sort of the plug that's going to go in this like false information hole, and why that is going to fall short, and maybe like how digital ethnographic approaches that do allow us to have this sort of more embedded contextual, historical understanding of why things resonate, and why people don't necessarily care if, so pointing out that something is AI generated actually doesn't really have the effect. Like, I wonder if in some sense, generative AI images are going to force disinformation scholarship to like contend with this way of going about understanding disinformation a little bit more. I'm curious if any of you have a reaction to that, and then I'll open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, I really hope so, because that's been my frustration. Like, I've been talking till I'm blue in the face, like, y'all, the truthfulness of this does not matter. It matters what it means. And I always give the example of, in Black history and culture, growing up, learned about Black history, we learned about the Willie Lynch letter, which was the letter between a slave owner and someone who was enslaved, and like, it was never real. We figured out it wasn't real a long time ago, but it never mattered to anyone. People kept regurgitating that because the story within the article is the false document that was circulated is what mattered, because the conversation was about like lack of solidarity within Black communities, right? And because Black folks are so conspiratorial, we have a lot of these stories that we tell each other that may or may not be true, but we never cared whether it was true or not, because the point is like, what is the moral of the story? And so coming from that tradition of a community that never thinks about the accuracy, also a community that has never been accurately depicted in mainstream media, right? Like the New York Times has told lies about Black people since its impetus. So you're never going to convince a lot of Black people to just trust the New York Times or any mainstream media. It's like we've always existed outside of that. And so that makes us more susceptible to what's happening in this disinformation space. I shared a link to an Atlantic article, what is his name? Warzel, the tech reporter. He talked about the thing you were talking about, Caitlin, with it's multiple governors and multiple pieces of disinformation, one of them being the woman in the flood, and how people are saying it doesn't matter because it's emblematic of the moment. And so in the article, he's saying like, this is bigger than a misinformation crisis. And I was just like, thank you. Like we have to start using different terms to talk about this because yes, it is misinformation. Yes, it is disinformation. But more importantly, like this is how we come to know the world, through stories, through deep stories, through these ephemerals. So we have to like meet people where they are. And to take from Noah Harari's words in Nexus, we have to move away from this idea that more information isn't like that there's a connection between truth and information. Just because we have more information doesn't mean we're going to get more truth. More information can just be confusing for certain groups. So what do we do in an information ecosystem where we're constantly being inundated with things and we don't have the tools to interpret them? And when I say tools, I'm not talking about media literacy, unless with media literacy, you're talking about deep historical critical knowledge. And that's harder to, transfer. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. I feel like we're getting out of the digital ethnography space right now, so I'll stop. But
I actually don't, but I don't think we are actually, because I think that this is that the digital ethnographic methods are going to have like such an important role to play in kind of reorienting the conversation in the way that your work is already doing, right? Yeah. Do either of us have thoughts on? Oh, sorry, Fenwick, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I mean, I just want to say this is, I think, partially what's important about this perspective and what it offers is you're not looking at the content of the message at all. It's about like, how does that message become a form of being or a way of being? Like, this is important about the partisan scene paper. It's like, it doesn't even matter what they were posting. It's just a way that they can hang out online. And so it becomes just useful because it's like, are you just bullshitting or not? Is this real or just hanging out? That becomes as important as what the actual content of the message is. But it really shifts what we think of about communication from, oh, these are forms of messages and information sharing, to ways of being and being online together. And that really kind of then makes, I think, some ways the content of the message less important to then what that message allows someone to do or feel. Or to me, it's like, why would they even do this in the first place? What constitute these forms or systems of desire that people want to participate in?
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to take our last 15 minutes and open it up to the audience for Q&A. Okay, see. Yeah, I'm going to call on Grant. Go ahead. Feel free to unmute.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this panel. This was great. I wanted to try to like revisit a couple threads that I'm noticing. One is like this idea of a vibe election is so interesting to me, and the utility of like getting at that and kind of explaining that or thinking about that through a digital ethnographic lens. And then also the comments about the role of images, memes, whether they be made by people or Gen AI or whatever, and in this election. And so something I was sort of thinking about is like, I'm wondering if any of you see sort of a relationship between like contemporary visual culture and like our just our way of seeing, and how many images we do look at in everyday life, and this sort of idea of like a vibe election. I don't know. It sounds like there might be some interesting threads there. I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts.
Can you say that last part again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's sort of an amorphous question, but thinking about the how visual elections in contemporary times are, and then also this idea that we're experiencing something we could call a vibe election, right? Like, is there a relationship between that? Like, how do we, what's going on online that like establishes a vibe? How do vibes shift or change? And like, what are the consequences? Maybe like what would be like the political consequences of that? And maybe that is just consequences on electoral politics, which I know we're kind of having a more broad discussion, but like looking at pictures, specifically of candidates, framing how people think of them or not, but also like, yeah, I'm trying to sort of parse out, like, I guess, like, so maybe a better way to phrase it is like, in your mind, like, what makes an election a vibe election? What's going on that sort of makes it that way?
I mean, I'm actually, listen, Grant, I like your question. I want somebody else to answer it because I actually don't quite understand what makes this one distinct from, like, let's say the Obama campaign, because Obama campaign was big body vibes, and it also was engaging with social media in very unprecedented ways that we had never seen before, with like creating those micro social networks. And also, as we found out later, they were digging into some of those, what is like the hardcore psychographics that later Cambridge Analytica was using secretly. So we were getting hyper targeted then. But I do know that when they say vibe election, they're just trying to say like, I think about Maya Rudolph in the SNL skit where she's like talking about Kamala Harris, like and she compares it to like an artist, like I can't remember who, maybe Charlie XCX or Lana Del Rey. It's like, it's very vague, but you just know it feels good. You know, it slaps or something she said. It was really funny, but that's the vibe. It's like, we know, like, we just know we're for Kamala. It's just in the water, or that's what some people on the left are feeling right now, or people are just angry. Everything is so effective because of that. But I personally think, I'm just giving you my thoughts, but I want somebody else to speak on this. It's just that memes in digital social media culture, they circulate because they're emotionally provocative. Either they're making you laugh or they're making you angry. So the vibes to me, when they say that, I think it is a broader conversation that we need to have about the kind of like the effective qualities of like what the algorithm is pushing to us and how. That's why it feels so different. This is not the first time we've ever mobilized social media or popular culture in a political campaign before, but in this moment, it feels like all of our emotions are being triggered and pushed in particular ways. But I want to hear other people's thoughts because I didn't understand the characterization of vibe election.
I was going to kind of say the same thing, but I was even going to go further back. Like, I feel like the Nixon Kennedy election was like a vibes election. Like, I think there's a vibes, like, and it was very visual. I mean, so I want us to be mindful. Well, one, I think the vibes election was like a PR stunt, right? Created by the marketing, like the Harris campaign team, which was great and like super effective and very sticky, and hopefully it translates into voting. But from like a media perspective, and like, I don't see anything all that different. I mean, the difference being we had the candidate pull out of the race very late, and there wasn't a chance to have a primary, and there was a lot of like legality around who could take his place, and they needed to come up with a story that stuck quickly. But so I don't know how much the vibes are like created versus different, but that's just me too. But Fenwick, I see your hand, so maybe you have.
Sorry, not just like how much the vibes are created, but almost it sounds like you're saying the notion of a vibe is in itself created, like creating that as like a thing with like ontological status is something that is maybe, you know, we'd have to look at political consultants to understand like how they kind of brought
Well, I mean, I think there's been polls, and again, I would love Fenwick because he's more of a, I'm not a communication, I'm not a political communication person, but I think to me, it seems like candidates win because they want to have a beer with them. So that's a vibe that's like very carefully cultivated in order to appeal to voters. But again, this is just my thoughts. I feel like Kennedy was a vibe.
Yeah. Kennedy was totally a telegenic vibe. Yeah, go ahead, Fenwick.
You know, I mean, to say, maybe just to kind of push what everyone's saying a bit further, it's like every election is a vibe election. And that's arguably what's being captured by digital ethnography, is that yet you're looking at is the communication of messages and emotions. And that's been and just to link back to some of my opening remarks about cultural studies, is that the idea of communications and vibes to me is like central. I mean, that's what like Raymond Williams was talking about, network structures of feeling. Like there's terms for this that I often feel like get forgotten about, and then I just want to say that, like, yeah, there's a tradition we draw on. Even to Francesca's point about the Nixon versus Kennedy, one of my colleagues, Charles Ackland, was talking that arguably that could be, that interpretation of Nixon being sweaty and the difference between television and radio could actually be dated back, for better or worse, to Marshall McLuhan. And that it was McLuhan's analysis of that helped frame that, which is not a defense of McLuhan, but it's more just to say that part of what so much of I feel like how political communication has to respond is just remembering that as a key part. Now, if we're going to define the vibe election, what I would say is, to me, it's a scholarly marker in some ways. And I think that this is, to me, is that often in the Obama campaign, the narrative has been, and I've participated in that narrative as much as anybody, it's the kind of technological sophistication of campaigning itself led to that success, voter mobilization. And that if it becomes if it doesn't, and there could be a whole story of just the data campaign that Harris is behind and all this stuff, but if there is seen to be a sense that the shift and the Brat summer was a defining piece of this campaign, that's going to have scholarly ramifications about like how that functions as a prototype for future campaigns. And that's going to not matter to everyday voters because it's all about vibes. But I think to scholars that might add relevance and legitimacy to this type of digital ethnography research, because it's not about like, oh, what was the big data doing that was able to say this form of micro-targeting was going to carry the day.
Thank you. Other questions? We could probably have time for 2 more. I want to invite Joni in our chat, who's one of our DEWG steering committee members. You've been chiming in with some stuff about your research and stuff. So do you want to like, I'm just interested in the stuff you're saying in the chat, and I'm going to ask if you want to weigh in.
No, of course. I mean, my camera has been off, but I have been here. I just think that the conversation is it's been a wonderful conversation. Let me start by saying that y'all have this, Jeff and I have been chatting about another paper that we've been writing about qualitative fluidity and the contributions of digital ethnographic approaches to qualitative communication scholarship, and a lot of the things that we talk about you have been kind of alluding to. I come from more of a health space, a public health space in particular, and like trying to understand better how Latinos make sense of the information they're consuming on digital spaces as it relates to decisions they make from a cancer education perspective or COVID or whatever those topics are. And the conversation that Brooklyn was having about, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not, if I perceive it as true, and the understanding of what these things mean to people, and whether or not there's something that needs to be fixed and how it needs to be fixed, and it's not necessarily with more information. In a public health and medical area, you see the synonym to contagion, right? And well, it's a virus, so let's treat it as such. If we have more medicine, then we'll address this situation. Or if we stop the spread here, then that has this ramification downstream, and that isn't necessarily what we need to be doing or understanding, but really getting a more nuanced appreciation of how individuals background and culture and influences the way that they make sense of the world around them, and how potentially narratives that they are construing based on the images and the stories that are being shared taps into something else. So I was just kind of thinking a lot about that, how this has implications broader than just a conversation about politics and the political, and how it can also inform research approaches in other realms.
Yeah, I feel like we're having, the same way I hope like we're starting to rethink mis and disinformation. I'm also hoping that we start rethinking epistemology, because Black folks exist out of these white, they exist outside of these white European epistemological frames, right? And so a lot of the things that you're talking about in terms of like health, misinformation, and disinformation that I see on the Black side of the social media, I keep thinking about the ways that these harmful narratives can be disrupted with new stories. Like instead of just trying to make people feel bad about believing that Dr. Sebi has a tonic that cures cancer, or make them feel bad about not getting vaccinated, why not tell the story about how like the original inoculations come from non-scientific, what is it? It was like it originated in like China, but also with African cultures, like people like with the smallpox, taking a little bit of the smallpox and inoculating themselves. And that was then later regimented with science. Like that story of thinking about the ways that like vaccines originate from holistic medicine helps people to go, okay, well then tell me more about this vaccine, but it's so hard to reach people when we're constantly just trying to badger them with, you're wrong, you don't know anything, you're not an expert. It's like, yeah, those things are given, but there's also other ways that we can reach people who are not working from the same epistemological frames that we're working from. And it's typically stories just as simple as that. But in order to share those, we also have to know them, we have to be trained in them. And that doesn't often happen. So I'm looking forward to the day where we also are thinking through science, but also like as Ruha Benjamin says it, she says instead of AI, artificial intelligence, why aren't we looking at ancestral intelligence, right? The way that we have come to know things historically is the way that we still come to know things. Our brains are not built for all this information, so why not meet folks where they are, as opposed to like beating them down with things that only a certain amount of us are trained to really understand. Us who are getting PhDs and our researchers, we should all be smart enough to know that like it took a long time for us to get to where we are with how we understand science and research. So how do we bridge that gap? So I think that's going to be like a larger epistemological conversation that we need to have. But I can't have it because I don't know health comm. but I'm interested in your paper and the stuff that
Yes,
you're
you can. It's important that we have these interdisciplinary conversations.
Yeah, but and that's another thing. It's so hard because within academia, we're just taught to think in disciplines. That's why I'm like, I'm not a Paul Com scholar. I'm not a health com. I don't do this. But all of these conversations are so relevant to the work that I do, because I'm watching people spread mis and disinformation about a variety of topics. And I know from being in community with other scholars, like what's wrong or what's missing from these conversations, but I don't know how to distill that into a simple story so that it really reaches people. But that is what I'm working on. And I guess that's my intervention in terms of being like a media studies scholar, is thinking about how like those stories can be taken up in these communities for good.
Yeah, and I love these connections that are being drawn between, health comm and paw comm and cultural studies and media studies, like, and almost like that, I have to bring it back to digital ethnography because I just feel so, but I really do think that like that is sort of a thread that helps us sort of see some of the way in which we're taking up, like, not just using similar methods necessarily, but also taking up similar questions when we're trying to navigate this this online, networked environment, an algorithmic environment. And in fact, I think like we do like these conversations across these substantive areas of expertise are so important. All right, we're almost at time. So I want to take our last minute to please ask everyone to join me in thanking this fantastic panel. thank you so much for coming and for sharing your expertise. And I feel so energized by this conversation, and it's just been absolutely wonderful. So really, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. And yeah, we hope to, those of you who are new to DEWG, please do come on our mailing list. Please do join us on November 8th. We'll be talking about how to find funding to do this kind of research that doesn't always get the big grants, right? But I think we've established in this conversation and others just how absolutely vital it is. So we need to figure out how to get money for it. So that's what we'll be talking about. And really, thank you all again, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank
Thanks,
you all
folks.
so much.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.